and welcome to a very, very exciting conversation. I'll be your moderator for today. My name's Amy Reams, but we're not here for me. We're here for the two other folks on the line, Elliot and Brian. And we're here to talk about some big trends we're seeing in the retail and consumer industry space. So, as a scene setter for this, we're all here because retail and consumer industry companies today are no longer just competing based on product. They're competing based on agility, right? And namely, how quickly frontline employees, store managers, and planning teams can make confident decisions. Yet those decisions are only as good as the data that's behind them. So today, as I mentioned, I'm lucky to be joined by Brian Smith, the head of partner solutions for consumer industries at Databricks. Brian leverages decades of industry experience and consulting experience to align data and AI solutions from the partner ecosystem with the evolving needs of enterprise customers. I'm also joined by Elliot Schmuckler, the CEO and co-founder of Anomalo, an enterprise data quality solution and the Databricks Emerging Partner of the Year. Retail is near and dear to Elliot's heart, as you'll hear throughout this presentation and this webinar. Elliot was also the head of growth at Instacart. So very lucky to have both Brian and Elliot align on the call here. So let's get into it, shall we, Elliot and Brian?
Yeah,
let's do it.
All right. So let's start by zooming out a little bit. In today's retail landscape, we've obviously read that the real differentiators not just on price or not just on product. As I mentioned earlier, it's really about how quickly teams can act. And what we've seen in the data is there's really been a shift in who is expected to act and who is expected to make data-driven decisions. So we're a data company, so I always like to start with a stat here, right? So I read a stat recently that said that 90% of organizations believe their success hinges on data-driven decisions being made by frontline employees. However, only 24% report having a truly empowered workforce, and 86% said their frontline workers need better data and technology to make effective decisions in real time. So I'd love to hear both of your perspectives. Brian, maybe we'll start with you here. What's changed about the way decisions are being made at retailers, and how is data playing into that?
Yeah, I think that what we're seeing is another big shift in terms of who's being empowered to make decisions. So, in times past, there was this kind of what we used to call kind of a command and control type structure where the top executive tier would make these decisions and everyone in the organization down was just executing on it. That started shifting in the 1980s, but it never really made it truly to the front lines. But I think now coming out of COVID and for a variety of demographic changing type patterns that are going on, a lot of organizations are empowering those frontline employees to be more engaged and to make more decisions. And that's driving the need for them to have data, right? If you're going to make a decision, it has to be an informed decision. And that's where we're seeing all of a sudden this new conversation about access to data and use of data and insights really beginning to emerge.
Yeah, Elliot, anything you'd like to add to that? Or maybe you could tell us a little bit about your time at Instacart as well and how your team used data to support business teams.
Yeah, absolutely, Amy. So at Instacart, we were on the vanguard of this, right? Probably one of the earliest adopters of this idea that Brian was talking about, which is truly democratizing data, right? Having everyone from our kind of in-store personnel or our delivery drivers to executives in the back office having access to data and being able to make decisions. And it was the key to our success, right? Most folks think about Instacart as a technology company, right? You might discover the Instacart app, right? And you place an order. But actually the magic is what happens after you place that order through the app. It's the whole logistics network of somehow getting your ordered items from the store that you've chosen to your house, and hopefully correctly, all within an hour. Right? And there's a lot that goes into actually making that possible. I would actually dare anyone to just do this for themselves, right? To complete a grocery shopping trip within an hour and get all the items that you want. And so it takes an incredible amount of planning and data and optimization. And a lot of it happens on the front line. A lot of it happens with the folks that are in the geography where your order is placed, maybe inside the store that's going to be fulfilling this order. They need the right data and the right insights to do their job because every minute counts. And it's incredibly hard to actually make that our SLA come true uh, every single time. And so this was a big focus of my work at Instacart was making sure we always had that data, making sure we were always making great data-driven decisions, fixing issues where that data wasn't available or that data was wrong or was being used incorrectly. And it very much required was what Brian was talking about, which is really democratizing data, allowing everyone in the organization to have access to high quality, trusted data that they could use in the right way.
I love that. Yeah, this concept of democratization. I think people have given, they've talked about that for a while. I'm curious, Brian, in your line of work, if you can also share any examples similar to what Elliot was just talking about at Instacart, right? Is there any example like enabling store associates or anything around supply chain or contact centers that you might be able to point to that's really been changed due to this democratization and access to data that frontline workers have?
Yeah, I think that you see it most when you walk into a store. You'll notice a lot of the cashier stands are now automated. There's a lot of things where folks are trying to offload those more predictable and automatable aspects over to computerized systems. And that leaves a lot of the customer-facing type work, decision making, like, hey, looks like we're running low on stock on milk in the dairy section, right? Do I send someone to back to hunt for stuff, or do I know I have a truck coming? Like, what's the right way to deal with this? If I've got promos going that I maybe want to go ahead and turn down a little bit, like take down the sales flag in the store. Those are the kind of things that we want to empower the store manager, the department manager, even down some to the individual employees to start making. Because again, so much else has been kind of addressed already, and that's what we're leaving for them. And this is really critical right now. Um, I mean, we're going to see, I think, more and more of this where folks are going to be more greatly empowered in those locations because, again, so much has already been offloaded to AI and other more robotics here in the future. That's absorbing that more predictable type work.
Yeah, I'm hearing a theme of, empowerment and democratization here. Maybe a question for you, Elliot. What are some of the challenges? I mean, you just talked about the dream, right? This 1 hour SLA, but what
Yeah.
are some of the challenges you've seen in enabling more self-serve access or empowerment, to use Brian's word?
Yeah, so many. And and I'm happy to say that as time goes by, a lot of these challenges get solved. But the first challenge is just getting data to be accessible, right, to everybody, having kind of a central platform that anyone in the organization can access to get at the data they need, right? And so this is why having platforms like Databricks is so helpful because you can literally put everything that you have, all the data that you might care about, into your Databricks data lake, right? You can run a SQL warehouse on top of it if you wish. And now everyone has direct access to that data. Now, maybe that's not the ultimate tool you want them to access the data through, right? Because they have to kind of know where the data is and know how to write SQL queries and those kinds of things, although AI can help with that these days. But you've at least gotten it to a place where the data is there. And if I want it, I can go and access it, right? And with Unity Catalog and those kinds of tools, I have the right access controls, right, around this data that I might need. So that's challenge one. Challenge two is, well, okay, I can access the data, but how do I know I'm using the right data? And the data that I'm using is, ready, right? Is kind of high quality, available, timely data. That's an ongoing challenge. And so at Instacart, that was actually a far bigger problem because we were early adopters of big data lake and data warehousing platforms. So we had the data all centralized, but there was so much of it, and so much of it was wrong or late or incomplete that it was very easy to use the wrong data set and to make, low quality decisions because you were looking at low quality data. In fact, in my first year at the company, I discovered that the team that was in charge of geographic expansions for Instacart, that was kind of in charge of lighting up new zip codes around North America, where Instacart was going to become available, right, and orchestrating all the things we needed in the market to make Instacart work. Their data hadn't been updated in 6 months. And so, as you can imagine, they were making pretty low quality decisions on which markets to open up for Instacart. And we had internal tooling, we had some amazing data scientists and analysts, right, that could have told you that the data was broken. But it was hard to make that into a self-service thing. It was hard to allow everyone that was reliant on a piece of data, that cared about a piece of data. It's hard to communicate to them, what state that data was in and whether it was truly ready and of high quality for their usage.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on what you're saying there, because I think there's a really important point is that when you get closer to the front lines and you're making more operational decisions, there's two things that happen. Is one is the latency, your tolerance for latency in the data goes down greatly. I'm not interested in what happened yesterday, right? That's an analyst back in the headquarters who's doing that type of work. I need to know what the current state or something reasonably close to the current state to operate off of. And I'm also not dealing with large aggregations of data, right? Where a lot of times, sometimes the inconsistencies in the data get averaged out in the aggregate. I'm usually looking at something much closer to the transactional grain of data, where data quality problems become much more exposed and are more problematic for me to make my decisions off of. I think there's a third factor too I would throw in there, and this is probably the hardest challenge. I mean, there's a lot that we can do with technology, but at the end of the day, we're talking about employees being more engaged, right? Using data, people who maybe do not have any formal training on data interpretation, right? Other than what they may have gotten through some basic schooling that we've all had. And we're asking them to use that and kind of make these leaps and determine what to do. And so I think that level of engagement and that ability to interpret, we're going to have to start training people across all levels to get more engaged and how to make good judgment. But I think it's an interesting challenge to try to take on.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw that as well, Brian, in that just giving you a dashboard, right? Even if it's a high quality dashboard, doesn't mean you're going to do the right things.
Right.
Right. So whether it's training or having some pre-built recommendations or having some kind of tools around that data that help you make the right decisions given those inputs, those are going to be pretty essential.
Yeah, it's an interesting shift because, again, you were talking about empowerment, doctorization, but now you're also talking about the specific role. So Brian, I loved your comment that you just made a second ago, but how you empower the right people to use that data. And at the end of the day, some of what both of you are talking about to me sounds like governance, right? How do you actually use and employ data governance strategies to figure out what it means to be data driven and empower the frontline worker or the business user, the analyst, maybe in Elliot's Instacart example case, enable and empower them without having them be reliant on more data fluent or data engineering type folks. So I'm curious, maybe starting with you here, Brian, from your vantage point, what are some of the most common challenges in what you're just describing when it comes to that governance component specifically of democratization and access?
Yeah, I think that the hardest challenge is really making it actionable, right? If you look at what Databricks has in terms of Unity Catalog, which is our governance layer that's kind of built in, we have automatic data lineage collection, we have metadata capture and generation. I mean, there's all kinds of detail available to you. But again, I'm in a store. Things are hectic. I got 20 things going on at once. I need to get a quick answer to figure out how to respond to an issue. I can't go dig through all that stuff. So how do we put this in a form that I can look at something and go, hey, you can trust this to make a decision, maybe even steer me towards an action, right? That might be recognizable in a situation. And I think that's where taking all that metadata and information, maybe infusing it with some generative AI capabilities, thinking through scenarios in advance so the generative AI is informed, and then turning it into guidance, right? So less about like automating, saying, hey, here's a situation, go do this. So there will be those circumstances, more about helping people look at the data and make judgments, and in a way, kind of training them on how to interpret this stuff on the fly. But that to me is the biggest challenge.
Yeah, and Elliot, when you were at Instacart, what were some of the early warning signs that you looked for, your organization looked for, to start to know that there might be issues within the data, or that the data started to slip?
Yeah, so I had this habit for many years of just very obsessively reviewing every dashboard, right? That was important to me, that looked over, and tracked the key business metrics that we had. And often I would review multiple dashboards covering the same metric to look for misalignments in that metric, because that was a surefire signal of something going wrong. Or I would look for situations where things were off trend, right? And there was an unusual spike or an unusual drop. Um, and so I was, if I was there and I was looking at those dashboards, I was able to catch these issues. But obviously, and in fact, this is one of the reasons, myself and Jeremy, my co-founder, started Anomalo. That's a very manual way
Mm.
to find those things, and it really relies on someone being incredibly tuned in and obsessive over tracking all that data, right? And it's just impossible to scale. Right. If I was gone for a week on vacation and we had a problem and I wasn't watching the dashboards, well, now no one knew, right?
Right.
Or if I found an issue and I sent, a message to the team, often they were surprised that the issue was there. It was a fire for them because they didn't know that there was an issue there. They weren't looking at the same dashboards, right? So I think, to your earlier point, part of this democratization, Amy, and part of kind of thinking of this as data governance is, how can I give this ability to spot issues to everyone? Not just give everyone access to data, but also give everyone the ability to spot issues with data, even if they're not, trained in data interpretation, right? They're not upset. They don't have the time to obsessively watch every dashboard. How can I use modern technologies to kind of detect these things for them and push them out to the right person when they should be looking at it? And this was actually the very core of what we built with Anomalo, right? Where, in addition to kind of self-service data access, with Anomalo, you can have self-service data monitoring. You just tell us what
Right.
piece of data you care about, and when we spot something, right, we'll push it to you so that you know.
Yeah, I love that, right? The idea of eyeballing metrics, no offense to you, your eyeballs are great, but it does not scale, right? And it certainly doesn't scale for an organization like Instacart. Brian, you work with some of the biggest retailers that there are that are working with Databricks today. Do you have any examples of that, or can you expand on that? Maybe more specifically, why is manual data monitoring, like eyeballing metrics as Elliot detailed, or writing data quality rules, why is that a drag on productivity in today's dynamic retail environment?
It's funny when I talk to some folks in some of the other verticals that I have peers there, and they're like, yeah, retail is really simple and really straightforward. We all shop, we all engage as consumers, we kind of have an understanding of it. And, I think part of that there's a certain level of ignorance in there, but the other is they don't understand the scale that we operate with. And that's the problem, especially for larger retailers. The scale is so overwhelming. There's a lot of systems that are built to solve kind of small problems often just choke when we're dealing with tens of millions of customers and hundreds of thousands of individual products in a single store location across thousands of store locations. Uh, Things just get out of hand really fast. And so little problems, uh, you know, each individual one is usually referred to as like death by a thousand cuts. No one cut's going to get you, but man, the accumulation of those is something. And that's the big issue that we struggle with here. So as far as specific examples, um, I, I would say for the most part, for a long time, people have known that we've had these issues. When it was more of a back office issue, we just said, hey, if you give us garbage operational data, we have to give our analysts that, and they just have to deal with it. We're dealing with a small group of highly trained, fairly sophisticated data workers. That's changing where we need to be more proactive. So when it lands on someone's front step, they can feel confident that they can use it because again, they don't have the time and they don't have necessarily the ability to really scrutinize it the same way.
Your point on scale is really interesting here. I'm curious, this might be a tough question, but is there something that you have both seen that might scale at, say, a smaller retailer, more mid-market retailer or local retailer, that when you get to the size and scale of Instacart or some of the customers both of you are working with at Databricks and Anomaly respectively, just simply can't keep pace, right? Are there any examples you can point to that are very specifically different in a scaled enterprise organization that you'd point customers to?
I'll throw one out there. I mean, one recently has crossed my radar. The difference between how mass merchandisers and say luxury goods manage certain data around like inventory, for example. Um, Big difference in the terms of volumes that they're dealing with. And so one can get away with relying on fairly manual processes that when you start talking about the big retailers that a lot of us are familiar with, that would never fly. I mean, just it's just not even imaginable that we could go down that path. And here you have two very successful organizations taking two very different approaches. Um, just that's probably the best example I can give without getting too specific.
Yeah, I have a pretty similar example, Amy. Instacart, of course, operates in kind of grocery retail, and as you imagine, there are grocers that carry a lot of products in their stores, and grocers that specialize in carrying a very small assortment of products in their stores. And I very much remember, a small assortment grocer being one of our partners and actually being very successful because they carry a small assortment, they can really optimize the pricing and all those kinds of things of those few products. And when we asked them for inventory data, we would get an Excel spreadsheet, right? That was clearly like mostly manually put together with maybe some
Sure.
automations. They exported some stuff from other systems and kind of massaged it, right?
They attach it to an email because I've seen that too.
Absolutely, Brian. Exactly. Exactly. We had
Now
to
look
write
email.
some code to grab the attachment and push it through our pipeline. Exactly right, Brian. And you can get away with that. And apparently you can get away with that even if you have 1,000 SKUs in your
Mm.
stores, right? But can you get away with that when you have 30,000 SKUs in your stores? No. Can you get away with that when your stores are not all the same? Where you might have 20 different varieties of stores across the country based on kind of regional preferences and the product of decades of M&A activity, right, that have allowed you to kind of build up your chain. No, you can't get away with that. um, and so the scale kind of rapidly sort of destroys this ability to use manual work to get the job done. You need to rely more and more on technology and automation.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue into the tech, and I love that example, right? Where, at the end of the day, both your companies were started based on this fact that the large enterprises have massive, massive scale of data. And so maybe, talking about the technology, if I'm a retailer listening right now, I'm trying to build an architecture that can keep up, allow my team to make real-time decisions, deliver trusted data to all the different business user, frontline workers. Tell me a little bit more about that, right? So, Elliot, maybe starting with you, how does Anomaly actually help retailers unlock this idea of productivity and democratization across the organization?
Absolutely. So the goal of Anomaly is to really sit on top of your investment in a platform like Databricks, right? You've centralized your data. It's now accessible to the entirety of your organization, right? You can put dashboarding and business intelligence tools on top of it. You can put machine learning and generative AI tools on top of it. But how do you make sure that you didn't just democratize access, you democratized quality, or you democratized the ability of folks to understand what's in their data and find out if any issues are going to impact their work. And so what Analo does is it simply connects to your Databricks environment. And for any data set you care about, you can turn on monitoring for it. And Analo will let you know if there are any significant issues in that data set that you should be aware of. Traditional systems that do this used to rely on kind of a lot of manual work, right? Maybe it's eyeballing the metric, or maybe it's setting up rules or setting up very specific things to check about your data. Part of why Anomalo is useful in democratizing this kind of data monitoring is we don't require you to do that, right? We use machine learning and AI to really learn what's normal for your data set and what's abnormal, and to send you alerts when something abnormal happens without you having to tell us what to look for. So it really enables a wide range of folks across the organization to monitor any data set that they care about with kind of a minimal of work, right, or a minimal of expertise. And that's pretty helpful, because it means that if you're using a piece of data in this kind of democratized organization and you haven't received any alerts from Anomalo, you could be fairly certain that that data is trustworthy.
Makes sense. Any examples from customers, especially Databricks customers on the line, that you can point to as far as how they're using data quality to deliver on a lot of what we've discussed today on the line?
Yeah, I mean, so many, right? So across every part of their operations, right? As retailers, often you're doing very sophisticated marketing and merchandising. And so understanding how those campaigns are performing and how those things are, creating ROI for your business is very important, right? I have big teams, big budgets running those operations, hopefully using very high quality data that's monitored. That's something that Anomalo can provide. Um, Anything about supply chain and logistics, right? We have many, many customers, retailers and beyond. We even have a customer that builds rockets, right? Where, supply chain turns out to be very important in the rocket building process, perhaps even more important than it is for retailers. I don't know. But anything where you're kind of tracking the arrival of goods, do you have it? Where is it? When is it coming? Right? Do I have it in the right amounts? Those are pretty critical. If you're running an online operation, right? Many retailers today are omni-channel, right? You're selling things online, you're selling things in your stores, you're doing some combination. Well, you might want to spot unusual transaction patterns in either of those environments, right? That's again something that Anomalo can spot for you and let you know if something unusual is going on. Maybe a sale is more successful than you expected, or less successful than you expected. Maybe something is happening in one geography and not the other. So all of those are pretty standard use cases for what we do.
And the old pattern for this too was they used to build data warehouses back in the day. And so we get a lot of data from the operational systems, and we would uncover these data quality problems. And so we'd go back and try to work with the operational side to either fix it there, or we'd write rules in there. But the idea was, well, when it's done, right? First of all, that's not really how this works. If there's a possibility for problems up there, there will continue to be other problems they'll kind of bite you here and there. But we're seeing organizations these days starting to rely more on external data, not just the data they generate internally. So even if you put all this energy into really locking down your operational processes and you've got it buttoned up and it's tight, you don't have that same control over your partner ecosystem. And that's really, really critical. The other thing we're seeing too is, while we kind of complain about the scale that we have to work with and how challenging that is, the volume of data we're starting to take on now dwarfs anything that we've ever seen in the past, right? We're dealing with large volumes of very structured data, but now that we need to start bringing unstructured information in, this data that we've ignored for so long, all of a sudden, I think one of the estimates I had was it's like 8 times, 9 times, 10 times something bigger than the volumes we've had in the past. We've got to start bringing this in, and guess what? There's been little to no quality control on all that stuff. And so this problem just becomes really difficult to manage, because it's just constantly evolving on us.
Yeah, it's I love the 8 to 9 stat. Something I read recently is that 80% of enterprise data is unstructured, right? Which is crazy when you start to think about to date in this conversation, we've been mainly talking about structured data, right? So I'm curious, Elliot, from your point of view, How are you thinking about unstructured data? How are your customers thinking about leveraging unstructured data?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of our customers are very excited about the world that we're in right now, where you have things like generative AI that, give us some superpowers around unstructured data. I actually remember this from my Instacart days. We, of course, had all the classic unstructured data problems, right? We had product images, a library of product images. Who knows what's in there or what quality they are? We had product descriptions, right? All these kinds of things, pieces of unstructured data that are going to be familiar to any retailer. And, we had to build all of these complex processes around generating those, testing the quality of those, finding duplicates, right? Now we might be in a world where generative AI can do a lot of those tasks for us, or generative AI can help us with service tasks, right? Can respond to our customers in a call center or over chat, right? And these are just amazing capabilities. But ultimately, the generative AI model that you're going to get, from chatgpt.com doesn't know anything about your retail operations, right? It has to be fed your data that's going to help it do the right things, right? It has to be fed your kind of product assortment to generate descriptions, or it has to be fed your customer service transcripts to become a great customer service bot, right? And so you somehow have to take control of these data sets if you hope to unlock their power in a world of generative AI. And that's hard because, as Brian said, that data hasn't been governed. Like, who knows what's in your customer service transcripts? And so it's actually one of the things Anomalo is very actively working on, and we hope to have some big announcements about it this year. But we're building a product called Unstructured Monitoring that's really designed to kind of give you a profile of these unstructured data sets and help you spot common data quality issues, right, in these unstructured data sets. Everything from, does this data set have PII information that I don't necessarily want to feed to my models to be regurgitated at an inopportune time later? Does it have bad words in it that I don't necessarily want to train my customer service bot to use with customers, right? So all of these things we're hoping to sort of automatically spot for you, so that you can start to really govern and control these unstructured data sets and start to really have confidence in using them for generative AI workflows.
Yeah, and Brian, I'm curious from your perspective, because what Elliot just described, this all feels so new, right? This idea that enterprises are trying to deliver on the promise of unstructured data for generative AI. What are you hearing from your customers, right? Databricks is at the forefront of data and AI. We're obviously all attending the Data and AI Summit coming up next month. Right? What are some of the war stories you're hearing as far as use cases and ways people and businesses are actually building generative AI applications today?
Yeah, I think at the beginning there was this rush to do all these kind of sexy, glamorous, little, kind of show off type projects, right? Hey, look, we're using
Totally.
Gen AI over here. Uh, I think that's kind of cooled down. And a lot of folks have been looking at like internal processes, especially around areas where maybe we're a little more resource constrained, and there's a lot of kind of interpretive work that we might be able to offload so we kind of minimize the strain on our limited number of employees that we have engaged there. We're now seeing folks kind of come back. The technology's matured. We're starting to understand how to work with this stuff a little bit better. Uh, and they're starting to craft newer experiences from this stuff that I think that will start to differentiate them with their customers. But again, back to the point that Elliot was making here, um, the big constraint on this is getting the right information together and getting it of the right quality to actually use it. There's a big difference between doing a pilot or a POC to kind of demonstrate that a capability is possible, to actually making it fully production ready on an ongoing basis. You've got change management around these inputs. Um, that's the process where I think a lot of folks are now starting to get a grip on, like, that's a core challenge we have to overcome, and we're going to have to be a little bit more sophisticated about how we think about this stuff.
Great. I am going to pause and take some questions here from the Q&A. We'll try to get to as many as we can, at least by answering in the chat, but if not, I'll try to throw some out to Brian and Elliot here. First one, this is great based on the conversation we were just having, actually. So Elliot talked about unlocking the power of unstructured data. My business is starting to explore generative AI projects on Databricks. Where should I start?
Well, that's I think that's
Why
an
don't you go,
area
Elliot?
everyone's struggling with. I would say, of course, first take stock of the data that you have. Understand the data that you have, right? We see a lot of our customers going through this effort, and maybe Brian's seen this as well, where they're kind of just first taking stock. What data do I have to begin with, right? And what might I use it for, right? What kind of generative AI application I might use it for. Then number two, start for those use cases that are interesting that you want to push ahead. Start looking at those data sets more deeply, and see what kind of governance you want to apply to them, what kind of issues you might want to filter out or redact or address to create really high quality sort of curated data sets. And that becomes the foundation for experimentation. That becomes the foundation for starting to use the generative AI models themselves on top of that data and seeing what they can do. Of course, very important to experiment and evaluate, right? Nothing's guaranteed to work, right? You need to kind of evaluate your entire workflow and measure whether it's producing the right results for you.
Yeah, and I think that, if you're just getting started, a lot of the conversation gets bogged down in those things that are kind of new to us, right? Which of the models should I be using? Should I be using Llama or ChatGPT or Claude or something like that? Which vector store should I use, right? Those are the wrong things to focus on. The answer to that's always going to change. Always start with, especially if it's your first one, start with the business process that you're trying to affect. Is it something we're already committed to doing today, but maybe struggling to be successful with because of, some issue that this might be able to address? Those are always really good ones to start with because you have people who really understand it and can help shape a fairly narrowly scoped project that's more likely to be successful. But then go back to the data. Think about how that data is created, how it's going to evolve over time, how you're going to expire it, what's the quality of this, how do you validate that quality. Uh, think about that process and how you're going to build something around that, because that's going to be the thing that's going to be the difference between a POC that looks cool and something that gets into production. And then as you start to gain success building these things, you're going to be in a position where you not only have the technical skills and the data foundation, you have the trust of the business to go off and do these harder, more advanced things. So maybe the short version is your first project, you're not trying to get on the cover of Wired magazine. Ideally, you get a gold star, pat on the back, and business keeps going on as usual, except that there's this little enhancement there, and then you build from that momentum.
I like it. So if I'm hearing both of you correctly, it's about data foundations, right? And also something that, Brian, you were calling out too. It sounds like it's about context as well. So the context and how that data is going to be used seems to be paramount in the world of unstructured.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's less about the technology, though there are certainly many things there we need to consider. We really need to think about the user, the way it's going to be used. How is it the stakeholder who's, banking their bonus on this? Uh, how are they going to decide that this is a go or a no-go? So really getting that alignment and putting your energy there, and then making sure you have the foundation to work off of. The tools will sort themselves out over time.
Right. Another question here. Earlier in this conversation, you were talking about governance. How does Unity Catalog play a role in that strategy? And then second part from the same person, Anomalous sounds great, but I don't want to log into yet another platform just to figure out a data issue. Can Anomalous work inside Databricks where we already live?
Okay, so I'll just answer the Databricks part of this really succinctly. Databricks provides a great level of foundational data governance through what we call Unity Catalog. And I think that's going to be really important for your data engineers and your data scientists, more your back office folks, but it certainly isn't everything. And so as you're using the data more expansively, while we do have some basic quality checks we can put in there, it's better to have something that's a little bit more I think, a little bit more flexible and expansive in how it looks at this. And to me, that's anomalous.
Thanks, Brian. I think, to the second part of the question, so one of the things that we pride ourselves at Anomalo is really working with all the other tools in your stack, right? Working with your stack as it is, working with your data platform. And so in terms of Unity Catalog, we actually integrate with Unity Catalog directly, where you can see results from Anomalo in Unity Catalog if that's what you're using to keep track of your data. We'll also integrate with other kind of messaging and collaboration tools that you might have. Alerts from Anomalo can come to your email or come to Slack or come to PagerDuty or Microsoft Teams, right? All those places where you're already doing the work, right? So, we kind of pride ourselves on not being a place where you absolutely must go and log into Anomalo every day to see what's going. We sort of try to push things out into places where you already are.
So you're saying you can email me a spreadsheet like we were talking about earlier?
I'd like to believe, Brian, that it's better than a spreadsheet, but yes.
Missed opportunity. All right.
It's great. Love the callback. One last question here as we're running low on time. You all did speak a little bit about this, but if you don't mind just going into more detail for the person asking. They said, my store ops team lives in dashboards and reports, but we're still always waiting on either analysts to double check the data or data engineers to fix and triage the issues. Is there a way Anomalo or Databricks can help my store ops team trust the numbers so they can just get on with their work?
Yeah, so maybe I'll cover the Anomalo aspect of this, and Brian, you can cover any Databricks elements. I think Anomalo helps in two ways for this problem. This is a very common problem, right? The dashboards are there, but are they right? Can I trust them? Do I need to have them double checked? Or there's an issue, who can fix it? And so we can help in two ways. One is we like to monitor all the data that's going into your dashboards. That's something that Anomalo can help you set up very, very easily, very, very quickly. And so as a result, if you didn't get an alert on that data today, you didn't hear anything from Anomalo, you can generally trust what's happening there, right? It doesn't require additional verification. The second part, and this is actually one of my favorite things that we enable, is it's not just you, the dashboard user, that's going to get those Anomalo alerts, or at least if things are set up correctly. Also, whoever produces that data, runs that pipeline, is going to get those alerts too. And very often that allows them to spot a data issue before it makes it to the dashboard. And so allows them to fix it before it causes problems downstream. And in fact, some of our earliest customers, that was always what they loved about Anomalo, where we allowed members of the data team to spot issues before folks like me that were obsessively watching the dashboards would notice them. And so they can fix them immediately and kind of avoid the sort of embarrassment and the fire of having to fix them later. So we kind of help with both giving you trust in the data and by informing everyone else about what's going on, hopefully getting it fixed much faster.
And Elliot, with the fact that you guys are publishing the data quality metrics and outputs into Unity Catalog, that means that if I'm building dashboards here, that I can query and retrieve some information. So one of the common practices that we see is often, here's your dashboard with your metrics, but often on there are little indicators of the quality of maybe the overall data set behind the dashboard or even individual metrics on there. Sometimes it's red, yellow, green. Hopefully you're using icons for colorblind type situations. Sometimes I've seen scales of 1 to 5 where there's kind of a slider to tell you, but something that tells you is like, hey, I'm giving you this number and we're pretty confident in this, or I'm giving you this number, but you know what? Don't overreact. Like you may want to dig a little bit before you go and do a drastic action here. And then just training people to look for those things and how to employ that. That can go a long way.
Yeah, that's a great one, Brian. Great strategy to use to, create a little trust indicator for your dashboards based on the monitoring that you're already doing.
Absolutely. Well, we're almost at time here. So again, if we didn't get to your questions, hopefully we will in the chat in the next minute or two here. But just to wrap up, Brian or Elliot, anything that you'd want to add if there's retail leaders on the line looking to move faster, democratize access to data so that their employees have the tools they need to succeed. Anything you'd want to just advise to them as far as an immediate next step to get started with here?
I'll jump in. I would say just think about those places where you really do need the empowerment here. Would love to take a look at Databricks. Databricks is great for real-time processing, weaving predictive capabilities into this. There's a lot of generative AI stuff that's a great wrapper for this. But the foundation for all that is having good, high-quality data available underneath all this stuff, and that's where Anomaly is going to fit in.
Yeah, and if you got your Databricks up and running, right, and you're starting to use data and you're worried about data quality, or you want to make sure folks are making high quality decisions because they have high quality data to make those decisions with, definitely take a look at Anomalo. We make it very easy to kind of get up and running and start spotting issues and make it available to everybody.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Brian. This was a great discussion. Really enjoyed learning from the both of you today. And thank you, everyone, for the great questions in chat. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Amy.